At 42, Sarah Bennett felt like her life had quietly fallen apart. Her marriage had ended 2 years earlier. The company she'd worked for nearly 15 years had eliminated her position during a restructuring. And after months of sending out resumes and pretending everything was fine, she found herself living in a small apartment with no real plan for the future. Then came a phone call she never expected. Her Aunt Margaret had passed away. The two had always been close, but Sarah hadn't seen her in nearly 3 years. Life had gotten busy. Calls became less frequent. Visits became postponed. And now, suddenly, there would be no more chances. A week later, Sarah learned that her aunt had left her one final gift, an old cafe. Not a thriving business, not a valuable piece of real estate, just a dusty little cafe sitting on the corner of a forgotten small-town street. Closed for almost a decade. Most people told her to sell it. Some said the building wasn't worth repairing. Others said nobody could make money there anymore. But when Sarah stepped inside for the first time, something felt wrong. The furniture was exactly where her aunt had left it. Old photographs still hung on the walls. A coffee cup sat behind the counter as if someone had planned to return the next morning. And beneath the kitchen floor, hidden under a worn rug, Sarah discovered a wooden hatch she had never seen before. At first, she thought it led to a storage cellar, but 3 weeks later, when she finally managed to open it, she found something her aunt had been hiding for more than 40 years. No gold, no money, no treasure. Just a collection of letters, photographs, and secrets that would change the way an entire town remembered her forever. Before we go back to the day Sarah arrived in town and unlocked the cafe for the first time, let me know down in the comments, where are you listening from today? And what time is it where you are right now? I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel around the world. And if you enjoy heartfelt mysteries, hidden family secrets, small-town stories, and inspiring journeys of second chances, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, let's begin. Sarah Bennett sat in her car for nearly 10 minutes after turning off the engine. Rain tapped softly against the windshield, while people hurried past on the sidewalk carrying umbrellas and coffee cups. Across the street stood the office building where she had spent almost 15 years of her life. For most people entering the building that morning, it was just another Tuesday. For Sarah, it was the end of something she had believed would last forever. The cardboard box resting on the passenger seat contained everything that remained of her career. A framed photograph, 2 notebooks, a coffee mug with a faded company logo. 15 years reduced to a box that barely filled half a seat. She looked away from the building and started the car. There was no reason to stay. Nobody was coming outside to stop her. Nobody was going to tell her there had been a mistake. The restructuring was real. Her position was gone. The company had already moved on. 3 months later, life still felt strangely unreal. Sarah spent her mornings searching job listings and her afternoons convincing herself not to worry. The apartment she rented felt smaller every week. Bills accumulated on the kitchen counter. Interviews came and went. Nothing seemed to lead anywhere. Some nights, she sat on the balcony watching city lights flicker across the skyline and wondered how everything had unraveled so quickly. 2 years earlier, her marriage had ended. Then her father passed away unexpectedly. Then the company downsized. One loss after another. It felt less like bad luck and more like being slowly erased. One rainy Thursday afternoon, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Sarah almost ignored it. Something made her answer. Hello? The voice on the other end sounded professional, calm. Ms. Bennett? Yes? My name is Robert Hayes. I'm calling regarding the estate of Margaret Bennett. Sarah immediately sat upright. My Aunt Margaret. Yes. The pause that followed told her everything before he even said the words. I'm sorry to inform you that she passed away last month. For several seconds, Sarah couldn't speak. The room seemed oddly quiet. She looked toward the window while memories surfaced unexpectedly. Summers spent helping at the cafe, the smell of cinnamon rolls cooling on metal racks, Margaret laughing while teaching her how to operate an ancient cash register, birthday cards arriving every year without fail. They hadn't spoken much recently. Life had become complicated. Yet somehow Sarah always assumed there would be more time. Miss Bennett, the attorney said gently, are you still there? Yes. Her voice sounded distant even to herself. I'm here. A week later, Sarah found herself driving toward the small town where Margaret had spent most of her life. The highway gradually gave way to country roads lined with farms and old houses. The farther she traveled, the more unfamiliar everything became. She hadn't visited in nearly 3 years. The town looked almost exactly as she remembered. A single main street, brick storefronts, hanging flower baskets, old-fashioned street lamps. Time seemed to move differently there, slower, gentler. The attorney's office occupied the second floor above a hardware store. Robert Hayes greeted her warmly and spent nearly an hour explaining paperwork. Most of it blurred together. Signatures, documents, legal terminology. Then he handed her a set of keys. Your aunt left you the cafe. Sarah blinked. The cafe? He nodded, along with the building. That's all. Robert smiled softly. She believed it would be enough. The answer puzzled her. Margaret had never been wealthy. The cafe had closed years ago. Why leave it to her? Later that afternoon, Sarah walked down Main Street carrying the keys in her pocket. Eventually, she stopped in front of a familiar brick building. The sign above the entrance had faded considerably over the years. Margaret's Café. Dust coated the windows. Several chairs sat upside down on tables inside. The place looked frozen in time. Sarah stood there for a long moment before finally unlocking the front door. The bell above the entrance jingled softly. The sound immediately transported her back 20 years. Everything smelled exactly the same. Coffee, old wood, cinnamon, time. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows. The counter remained unchanged. So did most of the furniture. A handwritten menu still hung on the wall. Sarah slowly walked through the dining area. Memories appeared everywhere. She could almost hear conversations that no longer existed. Customers laughing, dishes clattering, Margaret greeting regulars by name. It felt less like entering an abandoned business and more like stepping into someone's memory. A voice startled her from behind. I was wondering when you'd show up. Sarah turned. A woman stood in the doorway carrying a stack of books. She appeared to be in her 50s. Friendly face, bright eyes. Sorry, Sarah said. You surprised me. The woman smiled. Linda Harper. She pointed across the street. I own the bookstore. Sarah shook her hand. Sarah, I know who you are. Linda looked around the cafe. Your aunt talked about you all the time. The comment caught Sarah off guard. Really? Linda nodded. She was very proud of you. For some reason, that simple statement hit harder than expected. Linda spent several minutes showing her around town. Along the way, nearly everyone seemed to know Margaret. More surprisingly, nearly everyone spoke about her with genuine affection. The pharmacist knew her. The mail carrier knew her. The owner of the flower shop knew her. Every conversation ended the same way. "Your aunt was a wonderful person." Sarah found it both comforting and confusing. She knew Margaret had been kind, but she hadn't realized how deeply connected she was to the community. By evening, Linda headed home, leaving Sarah alone inside the cafe. The silence felt different now, less lonely. She switched on several lights and began exploring more thoroughly. The kitchen remained surprisingly organized. Pots hung exactly where Margaret left them. Recipes filled a drawer beside the prep station. An old coffee machine occupied one corner. Hours passed as Sarah opened cabinets and sorted through forgotten items. Around sunset, she discovered a narrow office near the back. The desk still contained papers and notebooks. A family photograph sat beside the window. Margaret smiled from the frame, looking exactly as Sarah remembered. "What were you thinking?" Sarah whispered to the empty room. "Why leave me this place?" No answer came. Outside, darkness settled over Main Street. Sarah eventually returned to the kitchen. She planned to lock up and head to the motel for the night. Then something unusual caught her attention. A section of the floor near the pantry looked slightly different from the surrounding wood. At first, she assumed it was a repair. Then she noticed the metal ring embedded near one corner. Curious. She crouched down and brushed away years of dust. The ring clearly belonged to a small wooden hatch hidden within the floorboards. Sarah stared at it. She had spent countless summers inside the cafe as a teenager, yet she had never seen it before. Slowly, she tugged on the ring. The hatch didn't move, either locked or stuck. She sat back on her heels, frowning. It was probably just an old storage space, nothing important. Yet something about its location felt deliberate, hidden, forgotten. As darkness deepened outside the cafe windows, Sarah remained kneeling beside the mysterious hatch, completely unaware that beneath the floor rested the first clue to a secret her aunt had protected for more than 40 years. Sarah arrived at the cafe before sunrise the next morning. The town was still quiet. Streetlights cast long reflections across the damp pavement, and only a few cars occupied the parking spaces along Main Street. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside, carrying a cup of coffee from the motel. The familiar bell above the entrance chimed softly. For a brief moment, she imagined hearing her aunt's voice from the kitchen, telling her she was late for work. The memory made her smile. Then reality returned. The cafe was empty, dusty, silent, and somehow hers now. She spent the first hour cleaning. Tables needed wiping, windows needed washing, shelves needed organizing. The work felt oddly satisfying. For the first time in months, she wasn't staring at job listings or worrying about interviews. She had a task directly in front of her, one small thing at a time. Around 8 o'clock, someone knocked on the glass door. Sarah looked up from behind the counter. An older man stood outside wearing a brown jacket and a faded baseball cap. He pointed toward the lock and smiled. Sarah opened the door. "Sorry," she said. "We're not actually open." "I know." The man stepped inside anyway and looked around the room. "Just wanted to see if it was true." Sarah laughed. "What? That Margaret's niece finally showed up?" The man extended a hand. "George Miller." Sarah shook it. "Nice to meet you." George slowly walked through the cafe. His eyes lingered on the old booths and photographs hanging on the walls. "Hard to believe it's been closed this long." "You used to come here?" George smiled. "Used to." He pointed toward a booth near the window. I sat right there every morning for almost 20 years. Sarah looked at the booth. Seriously? 6:30 sharp. He glanced around. Coffee, toast, newspaper. For a moment, his smile softened. Your aunt always had it waiting before I walked through the door. Sarah found herself smiling too. There was something comforting about hearing these stories. They made the cafe feel alive again. George stayed nearly 30 minutes, sharing memories before finally heading out. As he reached the door, he paused. You know, this place meant a lot to people. Sarah nodded politely. I'm starting to realize that. No. George looked around carefully. More than you realize. Before she could ask what he meant, he tipped his cap and left. The comment lingered in her thoughts long afterward, throughout the morning. More people stopped by. Some simply wanted to introduce themselves. Others wanted to share stories about Margaret. By lunchtime, Sarah felt like she had spent the day attending a family reunion she never knew existed. Everyone seemed to have a memory. A birthday celebration, a first date, a job interview, a graduation party. Somehow, the little cafe appeared connected to countless moments in people's lives. Shortly after noon, a man carrying a toolbox walked through the door. He appeared to be in his 40s, with dark hair and an easy smile. You Sarah? He asked. That's me. Ben Carter. He set the toolbox down. Linda told me you might need help getting the place running again. Sarah laughed. News travels fast around here. Welcome to a small town. Ben looked around the cafe. Electric still working? Mostly. Mostly? Sarah pointed toward the kitchen. Half the lights don't turn on. Ben grinned. Let's start there. The next few hours passed surprisingly quickly. Ben replaced several fixtures, checked wiring, and explained which systems would need attention before reopening. More importantly, he kept talking. About the town, about Margaret, about the people who used to gather in the cafe. Sarah noticed something interesting. Every time someone mentioned her aunt, they smiled. Not politely, genuinely. That wasn't common. Most people left memories behind. Margaret seemed to have left gratitude. Late in the afternoon, Sarah finally mentioned the hatch hidden beneath the kitchen floor. Actually, she said casually, do you know anything about a wooden hatch near the pantry? Ben looked up from a breaker panel. The hatch. Sarah immediately noticed the reaction. You've heard of it? Ben hesitated. Sort of. Sort of. I've seen it. Sarah folded her arms. And Ben scratched the back of his neck. Your aunt never let anyone open it. The answer caught her completely off guard. What do you mean? Exactly what I said. Ben closed the electrical panel. People asked about it for years. Why? Because nobody knew what was down there. Sarah stared at him. You never looked? Ben laughed. Margaret could be sweet when she wanted to be. And when she didn't? Let's just say nobody argued with her. Sarah found herself laughing. That sounded exactly like her aunt. Firm but kind. The kind of person who could end a debate with a single look. Later, after Ben left, Sarah returned to the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the rear windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The wooden hatch sat exactly where she had found it the night before. Small, unremarkable, hidden beneath years of routine. She knelt beside it again. This time she examined it more carefully. The wood appeared older than the surrounding floorboards. Much older. Someone had installed it intentionally and then worked very hard to make it disappear. Sarah ran her fingers along the edges. Still locked, still unmoving. Yet now it felt different, less like a forgotten storage compartment and more like a secret. Around 6 o'clock, she locked the front door and began closing up for the evening. While organizing paperwork in the office, she discovered an old customer ledger tucked inside a filing cabinet. Most pages contained ordinary business records, orders, expenses, deliveries. Then something unusual caught her attention. Several entries listed payments that didn't seem connected to the cafe at all. School tuition, medical expenses, utility bills. Sarah frowned. Maybe Margaret used the ledger for personal finances, yet none of the names looked familiar. Curious. She turned more pages. The pattern continued. Different people, different years, different amounts, all carefully recorded. None explained. She stared at the entries for several minutes before finally closing the book. Strange. Very strange. By the time she stepped outside, dusk had settled over Main Street. Most shops were closing. Lights glowed warmly behind storefront windows. Across the street, Linda waved from inside the bookstore. Sarah waved back. For the first time in months, she felt something unexpected. Not happiness exactly, but purpose. The cafe needed work. The future remained uncertain, yet somehow the building no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a puzzle, one her aunt had intentionally left behind. As she walked toward her car, her eyes drifted back toward the cafe windows. Somewhere inside that old building were answers. About the hidden hatch, about the strange payments in the ledger, about why so many people still spoke Margaret's name with such affection. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain, Sarah had a growing feeling that all three mysteries were connected. For the first time in years, Sarah woke up with somewhere she actually wanted to be. The realization surprised her while she sat on the edge of the motel bed staring out the window. For months, most mornings had begun the same way. Coffee, job listings, emails, rejection letters, worry. But today her mind wasn't focused on resumes or interviews. It was focused on the cafe. More specifically, the ledger hidden in the office and the strange hatch beneath the kitchen floor. By 7:30, she was unlocking the front door. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating tiny particles of dust floating through the air. The place still needed work, but for the first time, Sarah could imagine customers sitting at the tables again. She could almost hear conversation returning to the room. She set her coffee on the counter and immediately got to work. Chairs were cleaned, shelves were organized, old decorations were taken down and sorted into boxes. Every hour revealed another small task. Every completed task made the cafe feel slightly more alive. Around 9 o'clock, the bell above the door chimed. Sarah looked up to see Linda entering with a stack of books balanced in her arms. "Delivery," Linda announced. Sarah laughed. "I didn't order anything. They're not for sale." Linda placed the books on a table. "Local history. Thought you might want to learn something about the town if you're sticking around." Sarah smiled. "You're assuming I'm staying." Linda looked around the cafe. "You're already repainting shelves. That's not temporary behavior." Sarah couldn't argue with that. While they worked, Linda shared stories about the town. Most were small, harmless, the kind of stories communities tell for generations. Yet one detail stood out. Nearly every story eventually connected back to Margaret somehow. Margaret organized fundraisers. Margaret helped new families settle into town. Margaret hosted holiday dinners when people had nowhere else to go. Sarah listened quietly. The version of Margaret she remembered was kind. The version everyone else described seemed almost legendary. Around noon, Ben arrived carrying tools. "Thought I'd check those kitchen outlets," he said. Within minutes, the cafe became busy. Linda sorted books. Ben worked on electrical wiring. Sarah cleaned the counter. For the first time since inheriting the building, the place felt less abandoned, more like a community space returning to life. Shortly after lunch, George appeared carrying a newspaper. Without asking permission, he sat in his usual booth near the window. "Habit," he explained. Sarah laughed. "I figured." He unfolded the newspaper and looked around. "Feels good hearing people in here again." "We're not open." "Doesn't matter." George pointed toward the room. "The building likes company." Sarah smiled. Then she realized something. Everyone treated the cafe as if it belonged to them. Not legally, emotionally. The building mattered. That wasn't common anymore. Most businesses closed and people moved on. This place had stayed important long after the doors shut. Later that afternoon, Sarah finally found time to examine the ledger again. She carried it to a table near the window and began reading carefully. The entries stretched back decades. At first, they appeared random. Small payments, different names, different dates. Yet gradually, a pattern emerged. Most expenses involved emergencies, medical bills, utility payments, school fees, rent assistance. Nothing extravagant. Just help. Quiet help. The kind that arrives exactly when someone needs it most. Sarah frowned. Why would Margaret record these expenses inside a business ledger? More importantly, why keep them hidden? She flipped several pages forward, then stopped. One name appeared repeatedly. Emma Carter. 5 separate entries over 2 years. Hospital payment, prescription costs, mortgage assistance. Sarah circled the name on a piece of paper. She planned to ask someone about it later. The more she read, the stranger the ledger became. It looked less like business records and more like evidence. Evidence of something Margaret never discussed. Before she could continue, a shadow fell across the table. George stood nearby. "You found the book." Sarah looked up. "You know what this is?" George immediately became cautious. "Maybe." "Everybody in this town says maybe." George chuckled softly. "Learned it from Margaret." He glanced toward the ledger. "She kept records." "Of what?" The old man studied the pages. "Things that mattered." Then he walked away before explaining further. Sarah stared after him. Another mystery. Another half-answer. By late afternoon, she finally tackled the kitchen storage room. Boxes occupied nearly every corner. Some contained dishes. Others held decorations. Most had not been touched in years. As she moved one stack aside, she discovered a narrow cabinet hidden behind them. The cabinet door stuck at first. When it finally opened, several sealed envelopes slid onto the floor. Sarah knelt and picked one up. No stamp, no address, just a name written neatly across the front. Emma Carter. Her pulse quickened immediately. The same name from the ledger. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside sat a receipt. Hospital payment. Paid in full. Beneath it rested a handwritten note. No signature. Just a short message. Focus on getting better. Everything else can wait. Sarah stared at the note. The handwriting belonged to Margaret. She recognized it instantly. Another envelope contained utility bills. Another covered rent. Another paid for school supplies. All linked to different people, different years, different struggles. Yet every envelope carried the same pattern. Quiet assistance, no recognition, no explanation, just help. Sarah sat on the floor for several minutes, surrounded by envelopes. The discovery changed how she viewed the ledger. Margaret hadn't simply been keeping records. She had been documenting lives, people, stories, struggles. Why hide it all? Why never tell anyone? As evening approached, Ben prepared to leave. Before heading out, he noticed the envelopes spread across a table. "What's all this?" Sarah explained. Ben listened carefully. Then his expression softened. "That sounds like Margaret." "What do you mean?" Ben leaned against the counter. "She hated people feeling embarrassed." Sarah frowned. "About what?" "Needing help." He shrugged. If she did something for somebody, she never wanted them to feel like they owed her. The answer made sense. Too much sense. Yet it raised another question. If Margaret wanted privacy, why preserve every record? Why hide them inside the cafe after everyone left? Sarah locked the front door and returned to the kitchen. The building felt quiet again, comfortable, familiar. Her eyes drifted toward the hatch hidden beneath the floor, then toward the envelopes, then toward the ledger. A connection seemed to exist. She could feel it. The hatch, the records, the stories. Somehow they all pointed toward the same secret. Before leaving for the night, Sarah knelt beside the wooden hatch one more time. This time she noticed something she had overlooked previously, a small symbol carved near one corner. Not decorative, intentional. A simple coffee cup surrounded by a circle. She frowned. The same symbol appeared on the cover of the ledger. Her pulse quickened immediately. Margaret had marked both items deliberately, which meant whatever lay beneath the floor wasn't random storage. It was connected to everything Sarah had been uncovering, and for the first time, she began to suspect that opening the hatch would reveal far more than an old basement. The next morning, Sarah arrived carrying a notebook filled with questions. Most of them revolved around the same three things: the hidden hatch, the envelopes, and the ledger. The deeper she dug into Margaret's records, the harder it became to believe everything was a coincidence. The names appeared too often. The payments were too specific. And now, there was the symbol, a simple coffee cup surrounded by a circle, carefully carved into the hatch and stamped onto the ledger's cover. Margaret had left breadcrumbs. The question was whether she intended anyone to follow them. The cafe greeted her with its usual quiet. Sunlight filtered through the front windows. Dust floated lazily through the beams of light. Sarah unlocked the door and immediately began working. She had made a decision the night before. Instead of treating the building like an inheritance she might eventually sell, she would prepare it as if she planned to reopen, even if only temporarily, even if only to see whether the place still mattered. By mid-morning, she had washed every front window and rearranged half the dining room. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was enough that the cafe felt brighter, more welcoming. Around 10 o'clock, George arrived carrying a cardboard box. "Found these in my garage," he announced. Sarah looked inside. Old photographs, hundreds of them. Some showed town festivals. Others showed parades, holiday events, and community gatherings. Margaret appeared in many of them, always smiling, usually serving coffee, occasionally standing beside groups of people Sarah didn't recognize. "Why do you have these?" Sarah asked. George chuckled. "Because your aunt was terrible at keeping track of photographs." They spent nearly an hour sorting through the collection. Most pictures were harmless snapshots of small-town life. Then Sarah noticed something unusual. In several photographs, the same people kept appearing. Different years, different events, different circumstances. Yet Margaret always seemed close to them. A teenage girl receiving a scholarship award, a young father holding keys to a new apartment, an elderly woman celebrating a birthday. Sarah pointed toward one image. "Who's this?" George adjusted his glasses. "That's Emma Carter." Sarah immediately recognized the name. The same woman from the envelopes and ledger. What happened to her? George became quiet. "Cancer." Sarah looked up. "Did she survive?" George nodded. "Thankfully." He studied the photograph. "Had a rough time, though." Sarah didn't mention the hospital bills she had found. Not yet. Instead, she simply tucked the photograph aside. Another piece of the puzzle. Around lunchtime, Linda crossed the street carrying sandwiches. "You look like somebody building a conspiracy board," she said after seeing the photographs spread across 3 tables. Sarah laughed. "That's not entirely inaccurate." Linda sat down and began helping sort pictures. Before long, all 3 were sharing stories connected to the images. It felt less like research and more like uncovering a town's collective memory. Then Linda paused while examining a photograph from nearly 20 years earlier. "I forgot about that." Sarah looked over. The image showed Margaret standing beside several families in front of the cafe. Everyone held wrapped Christmas gifts. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "Community Christmas Drive." Linda smiled. "Margaret organized it every year." "For charity." Linda nodded, then added quietly, "Mostly." Sarah noticed the hesitation. "Mostly." Linda glanced at George. George suddenly seemed very interested in his sandwich. "What aren't you telling me?" Sarah asked. Linda sighed. "Margaret had a habit." "What kind of habit?" "Helping people without letting anyone know." Sarah leaned back. There it was again. The same theme repeating itself. The envelopes, the ledger, the stories. Quiet acts of generosity hidden from public view. Yet none of it explained why the records existed in the first place. By late afternoon, after everyone left, Sarah returned to the office and continued examining the ledger. This time she focused on dates rather than names. Another pattern emerged. Most payments occurred during specific years, particularly the late 1990s and early 2000s. Entire pages contained entries from those periods. Then activity gradually decreased. Sarah frowned. Why those years? She pulled out her phone and searched local news archives. 20 minutes later, she found an answer. In 1998, the town's largest manufacturing plant closed permanently. Hundreds of people lost their jobs. Families struggled. Businesses suffered. Suddenly, the ledger made much more sense. Sarah sat back in her chair. Margaret hadn't been helping random individuals. She had been helping people through a community crisis. Quietly, consistently, for years. The realization left her staring at the pages in silence. How much money had Margaret given away? How many people had she helped? Why had nobody ever talked about it? Then Sarah noticed something tucked inside the back cover. A folded piece of paper. Her pulse quickened. Carefully unfolding it, she discovered a handwritten list. Names, dozens of them. Some matched the ledger, others did not. Beside each name appeared a simple check mark. No explanation, no notes, just names. At the bottom of the page sat the familiar coffee cup symbol, and beneath it, a sentence written in Margaret's handwriting. "If you find this, start with the envelopes." Sarah read the line twice, then a third time. Start with the envelopes. It felt intentional, direct, as if Margaret knew someone would eventually uncover the records, as if she had anticipated this exact moment. Excitement mixed with confusion. Why leave instructions? Why create a trail? The answer seemed obvious. Because there was more. Much more. Sarah immediately retrieved every envelope she had discovered. Several contained receipts, others contained handwritten notes. Most appeared ordinary until she noticed a small number written in the upper right corner of each one. Not dates, not addresses, numbers. 7, 12, 21, 34. They appeared random until she opened the ledger again. There, hidden beside corresponding entries, were matching numbers. Her pulse accelerated. The envelopes connected directly to the records. Someone had organized all of this systematically. Then another thought occurred. If there were envelope numbers 1 through 34, where were the rest? She counted quickly. She had only found 12 envelopes. 22 were missing, or hidden somewhere. As evening settled over the cafe, Sarah found herself back in the kitchen. The wooden hatch waited beneath the floor exactly where she had left it. Quiet, unmoving. Yet now it seemed impossible to ignore. The numbered envelopes, the hidden records, the instructions from Margaret, everything pointed toward a larger collection, a larger secret. She knelt beside the hatch once more. This time she examined the metal ring carefully. Something glinted beneath years of dust. Sarah grabbed a cloth and wiped the surface clean. Her heart immediately skipped a beat. Tiny numbers had been engraved into the metal. Number 35. She stared at the engraving. The envelopes stopped at 34. The hatch was 35. A chill ran through her. Whatever Margaret had hidden beneath the floor wasn't separate from the records. It was the next chapter, and for the first time, Sarah became convinced that opening the basement would reveal the answer to everything. Sarah barely slept that night. The image of the engraved number kept replaying in her mind. Number 35. The envelopes ended at 34. The hatch was 35. Margaret had organized everything deliberately. The realization was impossible to ignore. For years, perhaps decades, her aunt had been building some kind of record, a sequence, a collection, and now Sarah stood one step away from whatever came next. By sunrise, she was already unlocking the cafe. The town remained quiet, but her mind certainly wasn't. She walked straight to the kitchen and knelt beside the hatch. The metal ring looked exactly as it had the night before. Small, ordinary. Yet now it seemed to carry the weight of a secret. She pulled again. Nothing. The hatch refused to move. Locked, sealed, hidden. Margaret had clearly intended for it to stay that way, at least until someone earned the right to open it. Sarah stood and exhaled slowly. She needed help. Around mid-morning, Ben arrived carrying a toolbox and a paper bag from the bakery down the street. "You called?" he asked. Sarah pointed immediately toward the kitchen floor. Ben followed her gaze and laughed. "You've been thinking about that thing all night, haven't you?" Sarah didn't bother denying it. 20 minutes later, they sat on the floor examining the hatch. Ben tested hinges, examined edges, checked for hidden fasteners. The more he inspected it, the more intrigued he became. This wasn't installed by accident. he muttered. Meaning? Sarah asked. Ben tapped the wood. Someone wanted this hidden. Really hidden. He pointed toward the surrounding floorboards. See this? Sarah leaned closer. The grain patterns aligned almost perfectly. The hatch blended into the floor so naturally that most people would never notice it. That's impressive. Ben nodded. It's also expensive. Sarah frowned. For a basement door? For one that's meant to disappear. The comment lingered in the air. Margaret hadn't simply covered a storage area. She had concealed it, intentionally, carefully, for years. Eventually, Ben stood. I'm going to need better tools. Sarah smiled. So you're interested now? I'm human. He grabbed his toolbox. You've got me curious. While Ben left to gather equipment, Sarah returned to organizing the envelopes. She spent hours cross-referencing names, numbers, and ledger entries. The more she worked, the clearer the pattern became. Margaret wasn't randomly helping people. She followed them. Not in a creepy way, in a caring way. One envelope might contain a hospital bill, the next, 6 months later, covered utility payments, then school supplies, then rent assistance. Margaret stayed involved, quietly, consistently, almost like a guardian angel operating through coffee sales and handwritten notes. Shortly after lunch, Linda entered carrying a stack of old newspapers. Research material, she announced. Sarah smiled. I'm starting to think this entire town enjoys feeding my curiosity. Linda laughed. That's because we want answers too. They spent the afternoon examining local archives. Most articles involved ordinary town events, festivals, elections, school fundraisers. Then Linda found something interesting. A photograph from nearly 25 years earlier. The headline read, Community Rallies After Factory Closure. Sarah immediately recognized several names from Margaret's ledger, families standing together, looking worried, uncertain. Some were the same people who later appeared in the envelopes. This was after the plant shut down, Linda explained. It hit everyone hard. Sarah nodded slowly. Margaret started helping around then. Linda looked thoughtful. Actually, she became different after that. Different how? Linda folded the newspaper carefully. More determined. That answer fascinated Sarah. Something had happened during that period, something that pushed Margaret toward this secret mission of helping people. The question was what? Late that afternoon, Ben returned. This time he carried a pry bar, drill, flashlight, and enough equipment to dismantle half the building if necessary. Please tell me we're opening it today, Sarah said. Ben grinned. That's the plan. Excitement mixed with nervousness as they returned to the kitchen. Linda joined them. Even George appeared unexpectedly, claiming he just happened to be walking by. Sarah didn't believe him for a second. The truth was obvious. Everyone wanted to know what lay beneath the floor. The hatch had become a mystery larger than itself. Ben worked carefully. Nobody wanted to damage anything. The process took nearly an hour. Finally, after removing a hidden locking mechanism concealed beneath one edge, a loud metallic click echoed through the kitchen. Everyone froze. Did that just... George began. Yep, Ben said. Sarah's pulse accelerated. The hatch was unlocked. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Ben grabbed the metal ring and pulled upward. The old wood resisted briefly before rising with a long groan. Dust drifted into the air. A cool draft emerged from below. Darkness waited beneath the floor. Complete darkness. Sarah stepped closer. A narrow staircase descended into the basement. The sight immediately surprised her. She expected a small storage cellar. This looked much larger, much deeper. Ben aimed a flashlight downward. Stone walls appeared below. Wooden steps, shelving. The space seemed to extend beyond what the light could reach. Nobody spoke. The moment felt strangely emotional, almost sacred, as though they were standing at the entrance to a forgotten chapter of someone's life. Sarah swallowed hard. "Well," George finally said, "your aunt definitely wasn't storing potatoes down there." The tension broke instantly. Everyone laughed, even Sarah. Yet beneath the humor, anticipation continued building. She took the flashlight from Ben and carefully stepped onto the first stair. The wood creaked softly beneath her weight. Then another step, and another. The air smelled old but clean, not abandoned, preserved. When she reached the bottom, the flashlight beam swept across the room. Shelves lined every wall. Filing cabinets stood neatly arranged. Boxes filled with photographs occupied one corner, binders filled another. Everything was organized with astonishing precision. Sarah slowly turned in a circle. This wasn't a basement. It was an archive, a hidden archive. Her heart pounded. Margaret had spent years building this place, maybe decades. Then the flashlight landed on a wooden sign hanging above the largest filing cabinet. The familiar coffee cup symbol appeared at the center. Beneath it, carefully painted in Margaret's handwriting, were 6 words: "For those who needed a second chance." Sarah stared at the sign in silence. Above the cafe, the evening sun continued shining through the windows. Below it, hidden beneath the floor for decades, waited the true story of Margaret Bennett's life. Sarah remained at the bottom of the stairs for several seconds, simply staring at the room. The basement was far larger than she expected. It stretched beneath nearly the entire cafe. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Filing cabinets stood in organized rows. Boxes carried handwritten labels. Everything looked carefully maintained, as if Margaret had expected someone to walk down those stairs eventually. Above her, she could hear George, Linda, and Ben slowly descending. Their reactions echoed through the room almost immediately. "Good grief," George muttered. "How long was she hiding this?" Ben swept his flashlight across the shelves. "This wasn't built overnight." Sarah nodded silently. Every detail suggested years of work. Decades, perhaps. The basement felt less like a storage space and more like a private archive dedicated to preserving stories. The sign hanging above the filing cabinets continued drawing her attention. "For those who needed a second chance." Those 6 words seemed to explain everything and nothing at the same time. Linda approached one of the nearest shelves. "Look at this." Sarah joined her. Each box carried a number matching the system she had already discovered. Box 1, Box 2, Box 3. The sequence continued all the way through the room. Every number corresponded to a folder. Every folder contained names, lives, histories. Sarah carefully removed the first folder. Inside, she found photographs, receipts, handwritten notes, and newspaper clippings. The material documented a young couple who had lost their home after a fire nearly 30 years earlier. Margaret had apparently helped them secure temporary housing, replace furniture, and eventually purchase a new home. Sarah turned page after page. The level of detail astonished her. Margaret hadn't simply written checks. She had followed people's journeys, celebrated their successes, recorded their recoveries. "This is incredible," Linda whispered. George shook his head slowly. "No wonder everybody loved her." Sarah continued reading. The folder ended with a photograph showing the couple standing in front of a house, smiling beside their children. On the back, Margaret had written a short note. They didn't need help anymore. The sentence nearly brought tears to Sarah's eyes, not because it was sad, because it was hopeful. Every file appeared to tell the story of someone overcoming hardship. The deeper they explored, the more examples they found. Medical crises, job losses, family tragedies, financial struggles. Margaret had quietly stepped into people's lives during their darkest moments and helped them move forward. Yet one thing remained strange. None of the records portrayed Margaret as the hero. In many files, her name barely appeared at all. The focus always remained on the people receiving help. Around an hour later, Ben discovered a small desk tucked into one corner of the basement. Unlike the rest of the room, the desk seemed personal. Family photographs covered the surface. A reading lamp sat nearby. Several notebooks occupied a drawer. Sarah immediately sat down and began examining them. The notebooks turned out to be journals, not daily diaries, reflections, thoughts, plans. The first entry she opened was dated nearly 25 years earlier. "Today I helped someone who reminded me of myself." Sarah frowned. She kept reading. The entry described a young mother struggling after losing her job. Margaret wrote about meeting her, talking with her, and helping her through a difficult period. The final sentence stood out. "Everyone deserves a second chance." Sarah immediately recognized the phrase. It matched the sign hanging above the filing cabinets. She flipped through additional entries. The same theme appeared repeatedly. Second chances, fresh starts, hope, opportunity. Then another detail emerged. Margaret occasionally referenced a specific event from her own past, never directly, always vaguely, but the references appeared often enough to notice. "The worst year of my life taught me this," or "I remember what it felt like when someone helped me." Sarah sat back. A new mystery was emerging. What happened to Margaret? Everyone talked about her generosity. Nobody talked about why she started helping people in the first place. The answer seemed buried somewhere in the basement. While searching the desk drawers, Sarah found a small key taped beneath one compartment. The key carried another numbered tag, 72. Her pulse quickened immediately. The folders only went to 71. That meant folder 72 existed somewhere, or perhaps something else entirely. She stood and began searching nearby cabinets. Eventually, she located a narrow filing drawer at the far end of the room. Unlike the others, it remained locked. The key fit perfectly. The drawer slid open with surprising ease. Inside rested a single folder. Number 72. Nothing else, just one file. Sarah carefully lifted it out. The folder felt thicker than the others, more personal. On the cover, written in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words. Open. Last. Everyone gathered around immediately. "Well," George said, "that seems pretty clear." Sarah laughed softly. "For once." She placed the folder aside. Curiosity urged her to open it immediately. Yet something told her Margaret had arranged everything for a reason. If this file was meant to be last, there were probably answers elsewhere first. The afternoon passed as they continued exploring. Every shelf revealed another story. Every box introduced another life Margaret had touched. Occasionally, Sarah recognized names, people still living in town, shop owners, teachers, retirees, friends. Suddenly, the community around her looked different. Many of the people she had met owed part of their recovery to her aunt's quiet kindness, yet none of them seemed fully aware of how much she had done. Near sunset, after Linda and George headed home, Sarah remained alone in the basement. The room felt peaceful, warm, almost alive. She wandered between shelves, reading labels. Then she noticed a photograph pinned to one wall above Margaret's desk. Unlike the others, this image featured Margaret herself, younger, perhaps in her 20s, standing beside a run-down diner. She looked exhausted, thin, worried, yet smiling. Beneath the photograph, Margaret had handwritten a short caption: "The year someone gave me a second chance." Sarah stared at the image for a long moment. Suddenly, everything made sense. The basement wasn't just a collection of people Margaret had helped. It was a thank you letter written across decades, a way of repaying a kindness she never forgot. But that realization only created one final question. Who had given Margaret her second chance? As the last sunlight faded through the basement windows, Sarah found herself looking toward folder 72 resting quietly on the desk. And for the first time, she suspected that somewhere inside that file lay the true beginning of the entire story. The following morning, Sarah arrived at the cafe carrying fresh coffee and a determination she hadn't felt in years. The basement had changed everything. What she initially believed was an abandoned business now felt like the center of a much larger story. The hidden archive beneath the floor wasn't simply a collection of old records. It was evidence of an entire lifetime devoted to helping people. Yet one question continued occupying her thoughts. Who had given Margaret her second chance? The photograph on the basement wall suggested the answer existed somewhere inside the files. And if Margaret had carefully arranged everything, the next clue was probably waiting exactly where she intended it to be. Instead of opening folder 72, Sarah decided to follow the trail properly. She spent the morning reviewing more of the numbered files. Several stories stood out immediately. One belonged to a young man named Daniel Foster, who nearly dropped out of college after his father suffered a disabling injury. Another followed a widow who struggled to keep her grocery store open after losing her husband. Yet another documented a family that nearly left town after medical bills consumed their savings. In every case, Margaret appeared briefly during the worst chapter of their lives, then disappeared from the story once they regained their footing. The pattern fascinated Sarah. Her aunt never positioned herself as a savior. She acted more like a bridge, helping people reach the other side of difficult circumstances. Around 10 o'clock, the front door opened. George walked in carrying a small cardboard box. "Found something in my attic," he announced. Sarah smiled. "This town has a remarkable habit of finding things lately." George set the box on the counter. Inside were dozens of old community newsletters dating back nearly 30 years. "Margaret used to help edit these," he explained. Sarah immediately began flipping through them. Most contained local announcements, school events, and charity drives. Then one issue caught her attention. The cover featured a photograph of Margaret standing beside several volunteers during a fundraiser. The article described efforts to support families affected by the factory closure. Sarah read every line carefully. Near the bottom appeared a sentence that made her pause. Local business owner Margaret Bennett credits her own recovery years earlier for inspiring her commitment to helping others. Recovery. The word stood out. Not success, not career, recovery. Sarah looked up. "George, what happened to Margaret before she owned the cafe?" The old man became unusually quiet. "Not my story to tell." Sarah sighed. "Everybody in this town learned that phrase from her, didn't they?" George laughed softly. "Probably." Before leaving, he pointed toward the stack of newsletters. "Keep reading." That afternoon, Sarah did exactly that. Several editions later, she discovered another article mentioning Margaret. This one was older, much older. The photograph showed her standing in front of the cafe shortly after purchasing it. The building looked run down. The windows were cracked. The sign needed replacing. Margaret herself appeared far younger and noticeably thinner than in later photographs. Beneath the image, a caption read, "Former waitress becomes owner after community fundraising effort." Sarah froze. She read the sentence again. Community fundraising effort. Her pulse quickened. Margaret hadn't always owned the cafe. She had been helped by the community. Suddenly, the photograph in the basement made more sense. The year someone gave me a second chance. Sarah immediately grabbed her notebook. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Around lunchtime, Linda arrived carrying lunch from the bakery. Sarah showed her the article immediately. Linda's eyes widened. "I haven't seen that in years." "You remember this?" Sarah asked. Linda nodded slowly. "Of course. Then tell me what happened." For several seconds, Linda remained silent. Then she sat down. "Before Margaret owned the cafe, she worked here." Sarah listened carefully. "As a waitress, for almost 10 years. Linda smiled faintly. "Everybody loved her even then." "So what changed?" Linda's expression softened. "Life." The answer sounded familiar. Too familiar. Sarah waited. Eventually, Linda continued. "Margaret was married once." Sarah blinked. "Married?" Nobody had ever mentioned that. "His name was Thomas." Linda stared out the window for a moment. "Good man." "What happened?" "Car accident." The room became very quiet. Linda explained that Thomas died unexpectedly when Margaret was still young. Medical expenses followed. Debt accumulated. Margaret nearly lost everything. The grief alone would have been overwhelming. Financial problems made it worse. "She almost left town," Linda said. "Really?" Linda nodded. The cafe owner at the time was retiring. Margaret wanted to buy the building, but she couldn't afford it. Sarah already knew where the story was heading. "What happened?" Linda smiled. "The town happened." A group of residents organized fundraisers. Donations arrived anonymously. Local businesses contributed supplies. People worked together. Somehow, enough money was raised for Margaret to purchase the cafe and rebuild her life. Sarah sat quietly absorbing the story. For years, she had been searching for the reason behind Margaret's generosity. The answer was suddenly obvious. Margaret spent decades repaying a kindness she never forgot. Not because anyone asked her to, because someone once did the same for her. Later that afternoon, Sarah returned to the basement. The room felt different now, more personal. She walked slowly between shelves, reading names and studying photographs. The archive no longer looked like a collection of charity records. It looked like a chain reaction, one act of kindness leading to another, then another, then another. Dozens of lives connected through a simple decision to help. Eventually, she stopped in front of Margaret's desk. Folder 72 still rested exactly where she had left it, waiting. This time, Sarah picked it up. Her fingers traced the handwritten words on the cover. Open last. She smiled softly. I think I'm getting closer, Aunt Margaret. Before opening the folder, she noticed something sticking out from beneath it. A folded envelope, one she hadn't seen before. Her name appeared on the front. Not Sarah Bennett, just Sarah. The familiar handwriting instantly made her heart race. Slowly, she opened the envelope. Inside rested a single note. If you've made it this far, you've probably figured out why I built this place. But before you learn my story, there are still a few people you need to meet. Sarah stared at the message. Then she noticed several names written beneath it. Names from the files. Names of people still living in town. Margaret had left one final trail. And whatever waited inside folder 72 would have to wait a little longer. The next morning, Sarah pinned Margaret's note above the desk in the basement and stared at the list of names written beneath it. There were 6 names in total. Some she recognized from the files, others meant nothing to her. Margaret's message was clear. Before learning her full story, Sarah needed to hear theirs. At first, the instructions seemed strange. Then she remembered everything she had learned about her aunt. Margaret never made stories about herself. She always focused on other people. If these individuals mattered enough to be included in her final trail, there had to be a reason. The first name belonged to Emma Carter. Sarah immediately knew where to start. Linda provided an address only a few blocks from the town center. By mid-morning, Sarah found herself standing on the porch of a small white house surrounded by flower beds. An elderly woman answered the door. Her hair was silver now, but Sarah recognized her instantly from the photographs hidden in the basement. Emma Carter? Sarah asked. The woman nodded. Yes. Sarah smiled nervously. My name is Sarah Bennett. Emma's expression changed immediately. Margaret's niece, Sarah blinked. You know who I am. Emma laughed softly. This is a small town. She stepped aside. Come in. The house smelled faintly of fresh bread and lavender. Family photographs covered nearly every wall. Children, grandchildren, holidays, birthdays. A full life. Sarah couldn't help noticing how happy the place felt. After a few minutes of conversation, she finally explained why she had come. Emma listened quietly while Sarah described the basement archive, the envelopes, the files, the hidden records. Tears immediately filled the older woman's eyes. She kept all of it, Emma whispered. Sarah nodded. Everything. For several moments, Emma couldn't speak. Finally, she looked toward a framed family photograph sitting on a nearby shelf. I wouldn't be here without her. Sarah remained silent. Emma eventually explained. 23 years earlier, she had been diagnosed with cancer. Treatment costs quickly overwhelmed her family. Her husband worked 2 jobs. Bills piled up. Their savings disappeared. One afternoon, an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a hospital payment receipt. Paid in full. Sarah immediately remembered the envelope she had found. You knew it was Margaret. Emma smiled. Not at first. When did you find out? Years later. She laughed softly. Margaret was terrible at keeping secrets when she cared about someone. The 2 women spent nearly 2 hours talking. By the time Sarah left, she carried far more than information. She carried perspective. Margaret's help hadn't simply solved financial problems. It had changed lives. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Sarah visited everyone on the list. A retired teacher who nearly lost his home after a medical emergency. a mechanic whose business survived because of a loan nobody knew Margaret had provided, a single mother who eventually became the town's school principal. Every story revealed another layer of her aunt's quiet impact. Yet something unexpected happened during those conversations. Nobody focused on the money. Nobody remembered exact amounts. What they remembered was Margaret showing up when everyone else disappeared. One afternoon, Sarah visited a man named Harold Jenkins. He lived alone in a small farmhouse outside town. According to the records, Margaret had helped him after losing his job during the factory closure. Harold listened quietly while Sarah explained the archive. Then he disappeared into another room and returned carrying a worn photograph. "I've been keeping this for 20 years, he said. Sarah looked down. The image showed Harold standing beside Margaret in front of the cafe. Both were laughing about something. On the back, Margaret had written a short message. "Temporary setbacks aren't permanent endings." Harold smiled. "She gave me that the day I thought my life was over." Sarah stared at the words. "Temporary setbacks aren't permanent endings." The sentence struck her harder than expected, because for months she had viewed her own life through the lens of loss, divorce, unemployment, uncertainty. Yet every story she uncovered involved people who eventually rebuilt something meaningful. Maybe that was Margaret's real lesson. Not charity. Hope. By the end of the week, Sarah returned to the basement carrying a notebook filled with stories. She sat at Margaret's desk and reviewed everything she had learned. The archive no longer felt like a collection of records. It felt like a map connecting dozens of lives. Then she noticed something she had overlooked before. A small corkboard mounted beside the desk. Most of it sat hidden behind old photographs. Curious. Sarah removed several pictures and exposed the board completely. Her breath caught immediately. Dozens of index cards covered the surface. Each card contained a name, a date, and a short handwritten update. Found work, graduated college, bought first home, cancer-free, opened business, new baby arrived. Sarah slowly stepped closer. These weren't case files, they were victories. Margaret had been tracking happy endings. The realization brought tears to Sarah's eyes. For years, maybe decades, her aunt had quietly celebrated people rebuilding their lives. Not because she wanted credit, because she genuinely cared about what happened next. Then Sarah noticed one final card positioned at the very center of the board. Unlike the others, it contained no name, just a sentence. The work was never about helping people survive. It was about helping them believe tomorrow could be better. Sarah sat down slowly. Outside. The sounds of Main Street drifted faintly through the floorboards above. Inside the basement, surrounded by hundreds of stories, she finally understood why Margaret left the archive behind. It wasn't evidence of generosity. It was evidence of possibility. Yet even as that realization settled in, her eyes drifted toward folder 72, waiting patiently on the desk. The stories of everyone else had finally been told, which meant only one story remained. Margaret's own. Sarah waited until closing time before returning to the basement. For most of the day, she had stayed busy. Customers, well, future customers, she reminded herself, continued stopping by the cafe. Word had spread that Margaret's niece was cleaning the place up. Some people brought photographs. Others shared stories. A few simply wanted to sit for a while and remember. The building felt more alive every day. Yet throughout every conversation, Sarah's thoughts kept drifting back to folder 72. It sat on Margaret's desk exactly where she had left it, waiting, patient, the final piece of the puzzle. By the time evening arrived, the cafe had grown quiet again. Outside, Main Street glowed beneath the warm light of old street lamps. Inside, Sarah locked the front door and descended into the basement alone. For the first time since discovering the archive, she felt nervous. Not because she expected something shocking, because she wasn't ready for the story to end. Over the past several weeks, she had spent more time with Margaret than she had in years. Not physically, through the records, through the photographs, through the lives her aunt had touched. Opening folder 72 meant reaching the final chapter. Sarah sat at the desk and carefully placed the folder in front of her. The basement seemed unusually quiet, almost as though the room itself was waiting. She opened the cover. The first item inside was a photograph. Margaret appeared much younger, 25 perhaps, standing beside a small roadside diner. Her smile looked genuine, but her eyes carried exhaustion. Sarah immediately recognized the image from the wall. The year someone gave me a second chance. Beneath the photograph rested a handwritten letter. Sarah unfolded it carefully. If you're reading this, then you've already met the people who mattered most. Not because they needed help, because they reminded me why helping mattered. Sarah smiled. Even now. Margaret began by talking about others. She continued reading. The letter described the period after Thomas died. Margaret wrote honestly about grief, loneliness, fear, for the first time. Sarah heard her aunt's voice without the protective distance of old family stories. There were no heroic moments, no dramatic speeches, just a young woman struggling to imagine a future after losing everything she thought her life would be. Then Margaret described the months that followed. Medical debt, financial hardship, the possibility of leaving town forever. Several pages detailed moments Sarah had never known existed. Nights spent sleeping in the diner after double shifts. Days spent choosing between groceries and utility payments. Applications rejected. Opportunities missed. The image of the confident woman everyone remembered seemed impossible to reconcile with the vulnerable person writing those pages. Then the story changed. Margaret described a knock at her apartment door one winter evening. Someone had left groceries outside. No note, no explanation. A week later, another envelope arrived. Then another. Small acts of kindness, anonymous, consistent. Enough to help her keep moving forward. Sarah turned the page. There, tucked inside the folder, rested dozens of handwritten notes. Different handwriting, different people. Some contained only a few sentences, others stretched across multiple pages. She quickly realized what they were. Letters from the people who helped Margaret. The community members who quietly supported her when she needed it most. Teachers, shop owners, neighbors, friends. Many had passed away years ago, yet their words remained. We believe in you. Keep going. Better days are coming. One note made Sarah stop reading entirely. It came from the former owner of the cafe. Margaret. Someday this place will belong to someone who cares about people more than profits. I think that's you. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. Suddenly the cafe's history made sense. Margaret didn't buy the building alone. The town helped her. The cafe itself was a second chance. Every good thing that followed began with one community refusing to let someone fall. Sarah continued deeper into the folder. The final section contained journals. Unlike the archive records, these focused entirely on Margaret. Her struggles, her victories, her mistakes. The entries spanned decades. Sarah read for hours, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. One passage stood out above all the others. I spent years trying to repay the kindness people showed me. Eventually, I realized kindness isn't a debt. It's a gift.
The best way to honor a gift is to pass it along. Sarah stared at the sentence. The entire archive suddenly crystallized into a single idea. Margaret hadn't spent 40 years paying people back. She had spent 40 years paying it forward. Then she reached the final page. Her pulse quickened. The handwriting looked slightly shakier, older. This had clearly been written near the end of Margaret's life. Dear Sarah. The words immediately caught her breath. For several moments, she simply stared. Then she continued reading. Margaret explained that she always hoped Sarah would inherit the cafe, not because of the building, not because of the business, because she recognized something familiar in her niece, the tendency to carry struggles alone, the habit of believing success required independence, the fear of asking for help. Sarah felt every sentence land with uncomfortable accuracy. Margaret knew her far better than she realized. The final paragraphs were simple. If life has brought you here, then maybe you're standing where I once stood. Maybe you're wondering what comes next. I can't answer that for you. But I can tell you this. Every person whose story fills this basement believed their best days were behind them. They were wrong. I was wrong too. Sarah lowered the pages briefly. Tears blurred her vision. After a moment, she continued. The final sentence occupied an entire page by itself. Don't sell the cafe until you've had a chance to fall in love with it. Sarah laughed through tears. It sounded exactly like Margaret. Direct, warm, stubborn. She carefully closed the folder and looked around the basement. Shelves of stories surrounded her. Hundreds of lives. Hundreds of second chances. Then she noticed one final item hidden beneath the folder. A small envelope addressed to her. Inside rested a single brass key. Attached was a handwritten tag, "Front Door." Sarah frowned, confused. The cafe already had front door keys. Then she turned the tag over. On the reverse side, Margaret had written one last message. It's your turn now. Sarah sat quietly for a long time holding the key. Above her, the cafe waited in darkness. The same building that had once given Margaret a second chance. The same building now offering one to her. And for the first time since arriving in town, Sarah realized she already knew what she wanted to do next. The following morning, Sarah unlocked the front door of the cafe before sunrise. For a moment, she simply stood there, with Margaret's brass key still in her hand. The streets were quiet. Main Street had not fully awakened yet. A few lights glowed in distant storefronts. The sky carried the pale colors of early morning. Everything felt calm, new. For weeks, she had been uncovering stories hidden beneath the building. Today, for the first time, she wanted to focus on the future. She stepped inside and switched on the lights. The cafe no longer felt abandoned. The tables were clean, the windows sparkled, fresh paint brightened the walls. The old building seemed to be breathing again. Sarah walked slowly through the dining area, running her fingers across chairbacks and tabletops. Everywhere she looked, she saw traces of Margaret. Not the sadness of losing her, the evidence that she had been here, that she had mattered, that her kindness still lingered long after she was gone. Around 8 o'clock, Ben arrived carrying a toolbox. "You look different," he said immediately. Sarah smiled. "Different good or different concerning?" "Good." He set the toolbox down. Like somebody finally made a decision. Sarah glanced around the cafe. "Maybe I did." Ben followed her gaze. "You're reopening, aren't you?" Sarah laughed. "Is it that obvious?" "You have the same look Margaret used to get." The comment surprised her. "What look?" "The one she got whenever she was about to do something she couldn't talk herself out of." Before Sarah could respond, the front door opened again. Then again. And again. Linda arrived carrying flowers. George brought old photographs for the walls. Several townspeople showed up with baked goods, decorations, and offers of help. Somehow, without anyone formally organizing it, the entire day became a community project. Sarah spent hours moving tables, hanging pictures, and listening to stories. More stories. Stories about first dates inside the cafe. Stories about job interviews. Stories about family celebrations. The building seemed woven into everyone's memories. By afternoon, she understood something important. Margaret's greatest gift wasn't hidden in the basement. It wasn't the archive. It wasn't the records. It was the community she helped create. Around 3 o'clock, Sarah made a decision. She climbed onto a chair and tapped a spoon against a coffee mug. The room gradually quieted. Everyone turned toward her. "I want to show you something," she said. Curious expressions appeared immediately. Sarah led the group into the kitchen. Then, one by one, they followed her down the stairs into the basement. The reactions were exactly what she expected. Surprise, confusion, emotion. People wandered slowly through the archive. Some discovered their own names. Others found relatives, friends, parents, grandparents. Laughter mixed with tears. More than once, Sarah saw people quietly sitting together reading old letters. The room that Margaret had hidden for decades finally came alive. George stood beside one shelf, shaking his head. "She never told anybody." Linda smiled softly. "That's because she didn't do it for recognition." Sarah watched from Margaret's desk. For the first time, she understood why her aunt preserved everything. Not for herself, for everyone else. To remind people that difficult chapters weren't the end of their stories. Later that week, news of the basement spread throughout town. More visitors arrived. Former residents returned. People shared photographs and memories Sarah had never seen. The archive continued growing. Every story seemed to lead to another. Every act of kindness inspired someone else to tell their own story. One afternoon, Emma Carter approached Sarah carrying a framed photograph. "This belongs here." Sarah looked down. The image showed Margaret standing outside the hospital years earlier. Emma stood beside her. Both women were smiling. On the back, Margaret had written a simple sentence: "Nobody succeeds alone." Sarah carefully added the photograph to the collection. Over the following months, the cafe officially reopened. Customers returned. Morning conversations filled the booths. Coffee machines hummed. Laughter echoed through the dining room once again. Some days were busy. Some weren't. Sarah discovered she didn't care as much about profit as she once thought she would. The cafe was doing something more valuable. It was bringing people together, exactly as it always had. The basement became a community archive. Visitors could read stories, view photographs, and learn about the people who shaped the town. Students visited for school projects. Families contributed memories. Former residents stopped by whenever they returned home. Margaret's hidden collection became part of the town's living history. One evening,
Nearly a year after Sarah first unlocked the cafe, she found herself alone after closing. The final customer had left. Chairs rested upside down on tables. Soft music played through speakers near the counter. Sarah walked through the darkened dining room and descended into the basement one last time before heading home. The archive looked much different now. New photographs lined the walls. Additional stories filled shelves. The room felt less like a secret and more like a celebration. She stopped beside Margaret's desk and looked at the photograph of her aunt standing in front of the old diner. "The year someone gave me a second chance." Sarah smiled. "I finally understand." The words echoed softly through the quiet room. For a moment, she imagined Margaret sitting at the desk, amused that it had taken so long. Sarah opened the final journal one last time. The sentence she had marked months earlier remained waiting on the page. People rarely remember who gave them money. They remember who helped them stand again. She read the words slowly, then closed the book. Upstairs, the cafe waited. Downstairs, hundreds of stories rested safely on the shelves. Between them stood a woman who had arrived in town believing her best years were behind her. She knew now how wrong she had been. Sarah switched off the basement lights and climbed the stairs. At the top, she paused beside the old hatch. Then she looked around the cafe one final time before locking up for the night. The building no longer felt like an inheritance. It felt like home. And somewhere, Sarah liked to believe. Margaret Bennett would have smiled, knowing that the greatest second chance she ever gave had turned out to be the one she left behind for her niece.